Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we can begin our webinar. So firstly, welcome everyone. I'm Alan Barrett, the Director of the ESRI, and you're all very welcome to this morning's webinar, which is to launch a new report, Wages and Working Conditions of Non-Irish Nationals in Ireland. So just to say, to begin, this work has been funded by our colleagues in the Department of Children and the rest. So as ever, we're delighted to be partnering with them on this this very important work. Migration is one of those topics that you don't require a big motivation or whatever like that to say why this is such an important topic. I think obviously everybody joining the call this morning will be very aware that this is an enormously important issue, and I always think the work that looks at the wages and the working conditions, it's almost like a barometer. I often think of how well host countries are doing in terms of accepting migrants and integrating migrants, because obviously the bigger the wage gap, the bigger the indicator is that sort of the be it disadvantage or exclusion or whatever like that is persisting. So this is an area within the institute that we've sort of been monitoring for a good number of years, and as the Irish experience of non-national migration increases, important that we keep an eye on this particular issue. And I think in today's report, it's particularly helpful actually that the authors have looked at this issue not just at a point in time, but we'll get a sense of what's happening to the wage differential over a period of time. Because again, I think it's we all understand that for a country, at a point in time, there's likely to be a wage gap. But if that's completely static, or indeed if it's getting worse, then it's a sort of a disturbing indicator all in all. So we've got a very busy morning ahead, and we've only got about an hour and 15 minutes to bring everything together. So in a couple of moments, I'll be calling on my colleague James Lawrence, who will take you through the report. James is one of the co-authors, along with Ailish Kelly, Fran McGinnity, and Sarah Kirsten. So after James, as we often try and do at ESRI events such as this, we'll get a number of different perspectives. So delighted to say Colin O'Loughlin from the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth will join us. Adrina Wafer from QQI, again, another sort of important perspective. And then Barnaba Dorda from SIPTU will provide yet another perspective on the work. So hopefully, if everybody stays to time, we'll have about 15 minutes for some Q&A at the end. So as ever with the webinar, if you can submit your questions through the Q&A function, I'll try and pass them on to the colleagues, and we'll get a bit of a discussion going. So should be an interesting hour and 15 minutes, and so we'll do our best, always recognizing people have busy days and busy lives. We'll do our best to stay to time. So with that, I'm going to call on James to do the presentations. James, so are you all set to go, and do you need to share some slides?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I'll just share my screen now. Let's make sure that works. That all okay?
Yeah, working perfectly.
Great stuff. Okay, yeah, thanks, Alan, and welcome everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us today. So we're going to be presenting on our work looking at wages and working conditions of non-Irish nationals in Ireland. And as Alan said, this is work undertaken with my co-authors, Ailish Kelly, Fran McGinnity, and Sarah Kirsten. The report itself is part of a program of research on integration and equality housed here at the ESRI, and now funded by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. So I would just like to acknowledge the department's funding and their commitment to the program. So, by way of introduction, Ireland obviously, as we know, has a relatively large population of foreign nationals, and these migrants are making a significant contribution to the Irish economy. So in the study period that we looked at, this is between 2011 and 2018, 14.3% of all employees in Ireland are actually non-Irish nationals. So as Alan was alluding to earlier, it's really important to understand the wages and working conditions of migrants, because these are often tightly linked to their wider social integration. So wages obviously critical for living and everyday expenses, but particularly important for reducing risks of poverty, which migrants can sometimes be more likely to fall into. But wages and working conditions are also important for things like mental and physical health, alongside broader social inclusion into society. And they're also important for, obviously, for things like housing, which can in turn affect things like family formation. And there's interesting knock-on effects that can come from people's wages and working conditions into their children's integration as well, and affecting how the second generation might do in Ireland too. So a key question, therefore, in our research program as a whole is how migrants are getting on in Ireland. And a lot of our prior work has in more recent years focused on exploring employment outcomes of migrants. This report sought to focus more specifically, really, on the wages and working conditions of migrants in Ireland. And the report itself goes into detail on both of these, but for the presentation itself, we'll mainly be focusing on the wages side of things. So in doing so, the report really sought to fill a kind of key gap in the Irish research on this topic, updating our understanding of the migrant wage gap to a more recent period, while also using really high quality data to do so. The period of study itself covers 2011 to 2018, and this was really kind of defined by when the detailed information on wages that we use was available at the time of the research. And so in looking really at the labour market experiences of non-Irish nationals, what we also do is we start to kind of compare these with those of the Irish national group themselves in Ireland. And this allows us to kind of gain greater insights, as Alan again alluded to, into processes of migrant integration. This is a common approach within the wider research, is looking at integration, comparing how the experiences of non-Irish nationals are doing to those of Irish nationals. So to give a bit of context around migration and the labour market in Ireland, this chart shows the number of immigrants coming to Ireland between 2000 and 2019. And as we know, for much of the 20th century, Ireland was a country of emigration. But this changed, obviously, most importantly during the economic boom around the mid-1990s to 2007, when immigration started to significantly increase. And this was especially after the period of A8 ascension, which brought significant numbers of Eastern Europeans to Ireland as well. And another kind of key thing is that this change has been relatively rapid, especially compared to a number of other countries. And so in the 2001 census, non-Irish nationals accounted for only 2% of the Irish population. But by the 2006 census, this proportion had grown to 10%, which really is quite a staggering increase over such a short period. Recent estimates in 2021 have now put this number at 13%. So the kind of the increase is really tailed off, but is still on the rise. So this next chart provides some context to the Irish economy itself. And here we're looking at quarterly trends in employment alongside modified gross national income. So we can see that Ireland experienced a period of significant growth until the advent of the recession around 2008, when both employment and GNI declined rapidly until around 2012, after which both started to increase again. And this is important to give some context to the report itself, which covers the period 2011 to 2018. And therefore, we start to look at things from the peak of the impact of the recession, and then through recovery up to the return to close to pre-recession levels. So a bit about the data and methods that we employ in the report itself. The study uses data from the labour force survey, and this contains information on people's social and demographic characteristics, such as their education, as well as detailed information on the types of jobs they do and the firms in which they're employed. However, a really nice innovation about this study is that it uses the labour force survey data, but then this is combined with detailed information on people's earnings, which is actually matched in to the labour force survey from the Office of the Revenue Commissioner's P35L data file. So we actually have highly accurate data on people's actual earnings. So this is great because it helps minimize the issues of error that kind of come from self-reported wage data and also missing earnings data as well, which is often present in other data sets. So in addition, the labour force survey provides a really big sample, which allows us to kind of distinguish between different migrant groups as well. Just very briefly, it's important to be aware that certain sample restrictions were applied to the final sample in the study that we used. So the report just focuses on employees only, those in the formal labour market. So there's no informal work, informal workers within the data itself. Those working between 7 and 60 hours per week, it focuses just on those to kind of minimize the impact of people in extremes. And we also focus on those aged 25 to 64. And the aim of this was to minimize the impact of student workers in the data and focus just on those whose main activity is employment. And there's a couple of other exclusions as well, but we can talk about those a bit more at the end. So when comparing the wages in the study, we focus on the gross mean hourly wages. So using this, the migrant wage gap is defined as the difference in the average hourly wages between all non-migrant workers and all migrant workers who are engaged in employment. So when we actually turn to modeling these things, we use the logged hourly wages with a small adjustment. And this means that the modeling results themselves can be interpreted directly as the percentage difference in wages between migrants and non-migrants. So the models provide us essentially with an estimate of the migrant wage gap. And using these models as well, it's great because we're going to be able to try and see whether we can explain the migrant wage gap itself, if there is one. And so we can explore things like how far people's education or their jobs account for this using the modeling. And just very finally, the results themselves are weighted to make them representative of the population of Ireland as a whole. So part of this study obviously focuses on the average migrant wage gap experienced by all non-Irish nationals. And the aim of this is to kind of give us an overview of the experience of all Irish nationals as a whole. However, as we all know, non-Irish nationals are obviously a very heterogeneous group. There's obviously different reasons for coming. Different groups have different rights for working as well. There's different language ability, different ease of transference of qualifications across borders and the like. And all these things might affect earnings and likely do affect earnings. So the chart above just shows us the separate migrant groups that we therefore intend to look at. So we try and get at this issue by breaking down the all non-Irish group into its constituent parts. And we'll be able to see whether the migrant wage gap differs for different groups. Just to briefly note that in this study, migrants are defined as non-Irish nationals, not those born abroad. And again, we can talk about potential implications that has for our understanding a bit later on. So to begin with, this chart here shows the raw average hourly earnings of Irish and non-Irish nationals in the period 2011 to 2018. So here, essentially, we're just looking at the difference in hourly wages between groups. And we can clearly see that non-Irish nationals are earning less on average per hour than Irish nationals. And in fact, non-Irish nationals are earning about €5 less per hour on average. So using this information, we can then calculate the migrant wage gap. So what this chart shows is the model difference in the mean hourly wages between Irish and non-Irish employees. And this controls just for the year of the survey only. So what we can see here is that migrants in Ireland earn on average 22% less per hour than Irish nationals. So this is the migrant wage gap in Ireland. And it essentially means that for every €1 an Irish worker earned, a non-Irish worker was earning 78 cents. So then we wanted to see, well, how far can we understand what factors might be driving the lower wages amongst non-Irish nationals? And so here we identified several potential drivers of this migrant wage gap. Migrants may have different social and demographic characteristics that we know are important for wages. They may have lower educational qualifications or be younger. But migrants might also work in different types of jobs as well. So they might be less likely to be in professional occupations or less likely to be members of collective representation organizations like trade unions, which again, we know is critical for wages. And also migrants as well, maybe in working in different firms and organizations, such as they might be more likely to be working in the private sector or smaller firms as well. So by kind of taking account of all these characteristics, we can see how much these factors really explain that 22% migrant wage gap we just saw. So here on this chart, what we're essentially seeing is the size of the migrant wage gap before and then after controlling for these background and job characteristics. And so we see that after controlling for all those characteristics, the migrant wage gap is now reduced to 14% less per hour compared to what it was previously, it was 22% less per hour. So essentially 36% of the migrant wage gap can be accounted for by these differences in personal and job characteristics between Irish and non-Irish nationals. But then it does suggest that at the same time, a significant migrant wage gap of 14% still remains unaccounted for even after all those factors were adjusted for. So several factors kind of might explain this persistent gap in earnings experienced by migrants. This might include things like English language ability. So this was unfortunately not available in the data itself, and we know that that might play a key role. Issues of qualification recognition, where migrants, especially from outside the EU, might not be able to enter higher paid jobs for which they're qualified, given issues with recognition of their qualifications from abroad, or even processes of discrimination as well might be at play. And we'll talk in more detail about these towards the end. So as outlined earlier, though, migrants are not a homogeneous group, obviously, and here we explore whether the migrant wage gap differs based on the nationality of workers themselves. So what this graph, this figure is showing really is the migrant wage gap for each nationality group under study. And the first key takeaway really is that most migrant groups in Ireland experience a migrant wage penalty. So this includes EU East nationals, those from the rest of Europe, those from Africa, the rest of the world, and Asian nationals as well. But what's interesting is that some groups experience a particularly large gap. And here we can see that EU East nationals have the highest migrant wage gap of all groups, earning around 35% less per hour on average than Irish nationals. But then what's also interesting is we see that for some groups, there doesn't appear to be any significant migrant wage gap. So EU West nationals and those from America, Australia, and Oceania essentially earn the same on average as Irish nationals in Ireland. But then we also see that for UK nationals, they actually experience a wage premium, let's say. So UK nationals actually earn more per hour on average than Irish nationals as a whole. So we'll next turn to looking at the migrant wage gap amongst men and women. So this figure here, we start to look at the mean hourly wage gap for Irish and non-Irish nationals, as we've been looking at previously. But this time we look at this separately for men and women. So as just discussed, we know that migrants earn less than Irish nationals. And we can actually see that again here. This is the difference between the blue bar, which represents Irish nationals, and the orange bar, excuse me, which represents non-Irish nationals. And we can see that both for men and women, there is a migrant wage gap present there. However, what this figure also shows is that women earn, as we've seen from much other research, less than men on average too. But this has an interesting implication. So we see that migrant women, that's the orange bar at the very bottom, of the figure have the lowest wages amongst all groups, earning 15.8 euros per hour. So what it appears like is that migrant women are actually experiencing a double disadvantage in wages, which is both for being women and for also being migrants as well. So non-Irish women earn 11% less than non-Irish men. That captures that kind of gender wage gap. But non-Irish women also earn 24% less than Irish women, which is this migrant wage gap. And then taking that together, we actually see that non-Irish women are earning 30% less on average than Irish men. So they really are this kind of double disadvantaged group earning the least of all. So we also see that when we look at the size of the migrant pay gap for non-Irish men and non-Irish women, we see that non-Irish men are earning 22% less per hour than Irish men. So that's a migrant pay gap for men. And we see that non-Irish women are earning 24% less per hour than Irish women. So the pay gap is relatively close. It's not hugely different. But because women are paid on average less than men, we know that non-Irish women really have the lowest pay amongst all groups. However, it's interesting, we do find some differences in the size of the migrant wage gap for men and women across different nationality groups. So, for example, African men earn 18% less than Irish men, but African women are earning 24% less than Irish women. And similarly, men from the rest of Europe are earning 16% less than Irish men, while women from the rest of Europe are earning 26% less than Irish women. So for some groups, the migrant wage gap is larger for women than it is for men. So let's now turn to the migrant wage gap over time. So we next explore whether there might have actually been any change in the migrant wage gap over the study period from 2011 to 2018. So this figure charts the change in the size of the migrant wage gap over the study period, looking at whether it changed between the early period, which was just out of the recession and early recovery, that's 2011 to 2013, and compares this to the size of the wage gap during the more stable period of economic growth, 2016 to 18. And we can see that clearly here over time, wages have increased for all groups, but they've actually increased at a faster rate for non-migrants. The result of this is that over time, the size of the migrant wage gap has decreased. And we can show this by calculating the migrant wage gap itself over the two periods. We see that in 2011 to 2013, migrants were earning 25.5% less per hour than Irish nationals. But by 2016 to 18, this had shrunk to 18.7%. So overall, the migrant wage gap declined by nearly 7 percentage points over this period. And what then explains this reduction over time? A good part of it can be explained by changes in the personal characteristics and job characteristics of migrants. For example, migrants in the later period were more highly qualified and had higher occupations. But even after taking account of that, there's a significant reduction in the wage gap between the two periods. But for some groups, this migrant wage gap didn't actually change significantly. So for Asian nationals, for example, there was no substantial change in their wage gap over time. So just to kind of start to wrap things up a little bit, we've seen this, that even over the study period as a whole, even after controlling for personal and job characteristic differences, a 14% migrant wage gap remains. So what might explain this? Obviously, unfortunately, we weren't able to measure English language ability. And from previous research, we know lower ability is associated with lower quality work and employment outcomes. So part of the story might be lower English language ability amongst some migrant groups. As mentioned earlier, migrants often face an obstacle to qualification recognition, especially for those from outside the EU. qualifications might not be equally recognized in Ireland, and this might lead to lower returns for equal qualifications. And obviously discrimination may play a part as well. Obviously there's a lot of international research showing, for example, that migrants are less likely to receive callbacks. Equally qualified migrants are less likely to receive callbacks than non-migrants to jobs. And there's also some work showing that potentially even after being offered a job, migrants are sometimes offered lower pay. But then at the same time, there might be other factors such as motivations for migration. Not all non-Irish nationals are coming for work. And accordingly, high paid work may not be a critical outcome for them. And those that do come for work may not also be seeking maximum salary returns. And potentially another thing that could explain this persistent gap is that migrants are lacking really the relevant social networks to help inform them about job openings, higher paid jobs, or how best to gain skills and experience. So essentially they have less information on how the system works. And we know from other research that social contacts and social networks are a critical part of allowing people to get jobs. So I think we'll be talking about these a lot more during the question and answer. So I'll just briefly sketch out some of the areas for policy that are interesting. We know that trade union membership has significant benefits on wages and that migrants are underrepresented there. So greater TU membership may be a key way of closing the gap. Qualification recognition, as we talked about, there's a lot of work that can potentially be done to make this process easier and more seamless. And obviously discrimination can be addressed. The anti-racism strategy, which is currently in progress, could bring in a lot of ideas about how this could be looked at in the workplace, including monitoring recruitment and promotion practices as well. English language provision is obviously a key factor that can be actioned that we might reduce the wage gap by improving the English language ability of non-Irish nationals, and also with a particular focus on kind of employment skills and employment language as well. And another possibility is the idea of having a corollary to the gender pay gap reporting, where migrant pay gap reporting could operate to raise awareness of issues of migrant pay gaps within organizations, because often employers themselves might not be aware of these kinds of differences that are ongoing. So very quickly, just to kind of bring out the key messages, we saw that non-Irish nationals earned on average 22% less per hour than Irish nationals in the study period, but that certain groups, such as Eastern Europeans, experience a particularly large wage gap. Part of this can be explained by different characteristics of the groups, such as the jobs they do and their education. But even after adjusting for that, a penalty remains. Migrant women themselves appear to face a significant double disadvantage in the labour market. But on the kind of more positive side, we have seen that the migrant wage gap has shrunk over the study period from around 25% to about 18-19%. Okay, so I think that's it from me. Thank you very much. And please do get in touch if you have any questions or would like further information about the program itself. So I'll hand over to Alan now.
Great, thanks so much, James. Fascinating study, and you did a great job in getting a lot of information into the presentation. So really enjoy that. Some questions are already coming in on the Q&A function, so I'm going to encourage people to continue submitting the questions, and hopefully we'll have some time later to address those. But with that, I want to introduce our first panelist, Colm O'Loughlin, who's with the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. And of course, Colm's department are the funders, as we mentioned earlier on, of the research. So it's nice to be able to thank him and thank the department more broadly, and also to congratulate them actually on their engagement with this material. Again, always sort of part of the role of the ESRI to be producing the research, but also to making sure that we're talking to the departments and those with the policy responsibility about what are the actions that flow from it. So Colm, looking forward to your reaction. So can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you, Alan. And thanks very much to James for the presentation, and indeed thanks to his to James and his co-authors for the report. I'll speak briefly enough. So yeah, Alan has introduced me, but just to say my more specific role is principal officer in the department in the International Protection, Integration and Equality Division. So that's a mouthful in itself, and the full title of the department is obviously quite lengthy too, but just a little bit of background on the Integration and Equality Research Programme. It's been running for a number of years now, formerly funded by the Department of Justice, but now sits with this department following the transfer of certain roles and functions from the Department of Justice in 2020. So look, we're more than happy to have the programme. I will say I'm a fairly recent arrival in this department, just since November of last year. But even in that brief time, we've seen the publication of two very significant ESRI reports in the integration space. So in November, we had the research into the trends in increased international protection applications in this country, which covered the first 6 months of last year, but really that we know that trend continued over the course of last year, and that gave us some very important insights into that increase. And then of course we've got today's report more specifically. So in terms of a kind of immediate policy response, mine will probably be quite high level, and that's partly because it will depend, I suppose, on ongoing conversations with other colleagues in the department and in other departments. Obviously, the Department of Enterprise have a key role and interest in this area too, but it's very much a good foundation for that. I think, as Alan mentioned, one of the real kind of strong points of this piece of research is the time span. Previously, we had not quite snapshots, but maybe 2-3 year windows into this area. We've now got a kind of data over an 8-year period, which gives us a clearer picture than we have had previously. And as Alan also mentioned, wages and working conditions, such a kind of key barometer of how people integrate into society over time. So there's a real value in that. I suppose I will say, and as everyone probably knows, this department has been under fairly considerable pressure in the last year, I suppose, in meeting the more short-term needs of migrants and particularly accommodation needs. So obviously we have tens of thousands of arrivals from people fleeing the conflict in Ukraine, and added to that the unprecedented numbers of arrivals seeking international protection, which I referenced earlier. And that pressure really isn't showing any signs of abating, unfortunately, but I think that probably makes it more rather than less important that we not lose sight of the more medium and long-term needs of migrants and the needs to support them in terms of their longer-term integration into Irish society. And obviously wages and working conditions are such a key element of that. So yeah, again, thank you to James and the team. This is kind of a key piece of work for us. It's really valuable piece of work which will help to kind of inform policy making in a very practical way within the department and by extension, as I mentioned, other departments and government, obviously. So from that point of view, I think this research is a real asset to us. So thanks again for that, and they're my immediate thoughts, but glad to engage more as the conversation unfolds.
Great, thanks so much for that, Colin. And you're absolutely right. The conversation will, as you made reference, it sort of goes back a number of years through the program with Justice, and hopefully it'll be going on for a good number of years as well as we continue to monitor the issues. But thanks so much for that. So our next panelist is Adrina Wafer from QQI, and really delighted to have a QQI perspective, because James kind of teed this up quite nicely in one of the slides. So I wouldn't describe it as pressure, Adrina, but anyway, there's issues to engage with and to respond to. So we're really looking forward to your reflection. So over to you.
Very good. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to respond. I think a little bit like Colm, we very much welcome this report and the depth of the research in it, particularly, I suppose, as it almost spans the length of QQI's life itself. I suppose from a number of angles, the NARIC system, one of the critiques, if you like, in the report is that the recognition system focuses a little bit too much maybe on academic recognition, and indeed I suppose that's a fair comment in many respects, because the National Academic Recognition and Information Service, our centre, is situated in QQI and it springs from the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which is about academic recognition for the purposes of admission to higher education from its roots, if you like, but has very much developed over time to include vocational education qualifications and for the purposes of employment. And I suppose, like everything else in education, it starts with where the individual is at and the purposes for which recognition are sought. And that also goes to the nub of the issue as to why QQI has taken the approach that it has taken in operating a 24/7 online, always accessible service that provides comparability statements against the National Framework of Qualifications for major awards that have been obtained within the jurisdiction where the person hails from. So anybody, anywhere, and the patterns of engagement that we can provide and are available through our annual reports illustrate a consistent high level of engagement with our comparability statements from jurisdictions both within Europe and globally. Principally, I suppose the key countries outside of Europe would be Brazil and Australia and South Africa would be the sort of the top hitters. But within Europe, again, sort of very much echoing the patterns in the report that are there. But what we can see is that from those who engage with NARIC in Ireland, largely it's actually for the purpose of employment, which is very interesting to us. And over the last few years, we've had increased demand from employers to explain the system, to show them how to use the NARIC service and how to engage more with us. And we've had more detailed briefings indeed with the National Recruitment Federation and with other specific sectoral groups that provide recruitment. So I think this is a very important report, and it signals will be very helpful to us in our global engagement. The Lisbon Recognition Convention, of course, is a recognition convention that provides for Europe, but we're moving, as the Department of Further Higher Education, Research and Innovation Science is leading out on this in terms of further engagement with the Global Recognition Convention, which again will enhance our capacity to recognize qualifications from right across the world and to increase mobility. And I think the other thing I would say, of course, is President Higgins is so exciting about this and about our acknowledgement of mobility as a fact of life and as a way of being. And he really challenges and encourages us to understand mobility as a stasis, as not being our way of being in the world, but in fact mobility as a key characteristic. And I think that's getting the vision right behind all of this and behind integration is such an important thing. And as Colm said, understanding that in real terms, in terms of how people earn, how they the capacity they have to provide for their families, and therefore to integrate better within society is so important. If you can't provide childcare for your family, then that of course impedes on your capacity to engage better with working life and to contribute according to your level of qualification. So that is very important for us. And we welcome opportunities, obviously, to engage better with employers, and that would be of tremendous importance to us. But we are a very small unit. So we see this in QQI, and we welcome the fact that NARIC is situated within QQI, within the bigger system, if you like, of qualifications, in both of the development of standards, so that we can integrate as best we can across the entire framework and the way that qualifications work nationally. Delighted to take any questions, though.
Great, thanks so much, Adrina. I'm sure there'll be a couple of questions when we get to the discussion. But a moment, I mean, I think the issue of migrant wages and qualifications, this is something I've been listening to for probably 20, 25 years. And it's one of those things where it's, yeah, it's an easy thing to say, but it's a considerably more difficult thing to actually engineer. So we may come back to it, but as often happens at the ESRI webinars, we often have perspectives that sort of suggest we need an entire morning to discuss some of the logistics around it. But listen, we'll come back, and thanks so much for those comments and for being with us today. Eager to get to our third panelist. So this is Barnaba Dorda, who is with SIPTU. And again, James nicely set up things for you, Barnaba. Again, the potential role for unions in this area. And again, this is a long-running issue that I know you've been thinking about for quite a while. So we look forward to your comments as well.
All right, thank you, Alan. I think I'm the only one who prepared a presentation as an ESRI for that publication. That's first of all, I think was long overdue, and I'm happy to see something which unions, myself, were talking about, that there is a wage gap in existence, a migrant wage gap, but we were looking for something concrete data. So I'm really glad to see that publication. At the same time, I must say that the findings are not surprising, and it shows that while migrants significantly contribute to the Irish economy, they are not equally rewarded for it. And when I'm looking to this publication, I said that no, I found some kind of traits resembling my own story when I came to Ireland, because when I came to Ireland in 2005, in this huge influx of the migrants from HTU, I did not speak English very well. I thought about myself being here for a very short time. I completed my law degree in Poland, but obviously I thought that I won't be able to do my job as a lawyer in Ireland. So instead I found a work in the restaurant. I was working for 12 hours a day for minimum wage, and I thought this as a very short period of getting money and maybe go back to Poland. But then I improved my English throughout that short time when I was working in the restaurant, and I found a job in the unions. And I stayed in the union since end of 2005. And even though initially I was not working in my kind of the field of expertise representing the people before the courts, but right now I'm working in the Workers' Rights Center of SIPTU, where I'm representing the union members at the local level with employers, at the disciplinary hearings, as well as at the WRC and labor court. But maybe interestingly enough for that today's presentation, all right, for a number of years, I was organizing migrant workers into the union. When we think about how to close the gap, I think that the researchers put some very good ideas. I will very support of those ideas. And one of the goal to close the gap was to know that the migrants need to join the union and improve their conditions to the collective bargaining. And I always like the idea that people can get together, migrants from different backgrounds can get together in the workplace, work together, and through their joint efforts, they can change the terms and conditions of employment. And the unions, especially SIPTU, I would say, from my own experience, were on forefront of that approach to reach out to migrants. And there were different activities we did as a SIPTU. I think that I hope that you can see that. So initially, the SIPTU hired the non-Irish union organizers, including myself. So we were going and organizing the migrants, but as well, we targeted relevant sectors where migrants were in vast majority or in significant numbers. For example, we targeted red meat sector or the contract cleaning sector. And here I just put the picture of the one of the actions throughout the contract cleaning campaign, when you can see the Irish shop steward and the Polish shop steward who were working together in the committee of that campaign. And that campaign was positively is example of one of the successes, because at the end of that campaign we reached out to introduce the sectoral agreement for the contract cleaners. And what is equally important, that the terms and conditions for that sector was not being negotiated only for the migrants and the other workers, but with the migrants. Those migrants were those shop stewards, those activists were involved in negotiating the terms and conditions with the employers. So our aim was that to always not only bring them into the membership, but as well to allow them to become part of it and negotiate the terms and conditions of employment. Other activities was there was very interesting activity run by EU in conjunction with IBEC, integrated workplaces, back in 2008, just before the recession, under the auspices of the Equality Authority, just to promote the equality in the workplaces and to show the benefits of integrated workplaces. And the kind of the final one of the kind of final what we did is that like extremely important to find out the migrant leaders within the workplaces and upskill them. And SIPTO is doing that to the SIPTO Migrant Worker Support Network. So every 3 times per year, we are meeting up with a different group of the migrant leaders, and we are upskilling them and we're learning from them, and so they can go back and be leaders in their workplaces and bring more members and make a change. But at the same time, I must say, from my experience as an organizer back between 2005 and 2014, I found that there's a lot of barriers towards organizing the migrants and workers as a whole. And mainly it is because I believe that the government has this attitude towards the how to tackle integration by that they are more focused on the quantity of jobs than quality of jobs. And that's even reflected in the most recent integration strategy from 2017, that the important factor is that the migrant has to be in the job. Less important, what are the terms and conditions of the employment. When I'm looking back in all those years, I think that there was no measures to somehow incentivize employers to recognize unions or engage in collective bargaining. And I believe that there were opportunities for the government to do so. For example, if the government is supporting the businesses financially, they can put some measures that if the employee is receiving some financial support, they need to engage in collective bargaining with workers. I will touch upon that collective bargaining in a moment. And then there was also to some extent very slow response from the government to this rapid influx of migrants, and like putting a blind eye of the possibility of eliminating this possible migrant wage gap. For example, in 2006, unions were pushing government to employ more labor inspectors, because at that time there was about, I think, 17 of them. And finally, in 2006, 7, the government employed like around 90 inspectors, many of them from different backgrounds. But it took a long time for the government to employ non-Irish speaking inspectors in government. Another example would be, for example, the most recent one, when the union pushed for the sick pay, mandatory sick pay, because in many sectors there's very low unionizations, and many of the migrant workers do not enjoy sick pay scheme, and that was very visible during the COVID time, when particularly I think it was highlighted prominent in the mid sector. Migrants were suffering from that, and that was an example that union pushed to introduce that sick pay, so the migrants could be protected in those essential sectors. So and and the final and the most important, I think, thing is that there's a lack of union recognition and the proper right to collective bargaining, and this is something which is truly frustrating for workers, especially migrants. And I come back here at the local level that when we look at the barriers at the local level, one can say the language barrier is a problem. That workers from the different groups, different ethnic groups cannot really communicate with each other. That might be a problematic. Then there is a short stay attitude. This perspective of the migrant, like, I'm here for just for a short time, so I don't really want to join the union because I'm leaving next year. And then, okay, this is a lack of experience and understanding of this very bit strange system of Irish industrial relations. All those refers to the labor code at the different sections of the IR Act. But I think what is, from my own experience as an organizer, was truly difficult to see that there's an employer's hostile attitude towards the union activity on the ground, especially supported by the fact that they don't need to talk to the unions; they can ignore the unions. And for a number of years, they were able to ignore them quite successfully. Note, okay, that there is a need for the unions, okay, to be more engaged on the ground level, but at the same time, there need to be tools for the unions to successfully organize the workers. And I welcome the recent report from the high-level working group on fair collective bargaining. There will be introduction of the EU directive, and the island has to implement the directive on collective bargaining. So I hope that this year government act on this and introduce a fair system of collective bargaining, so the workers on the ground could successfully not only join the union, but to see that the employers can engage with them to negotiate the improved terms and conditions of employment. And I believe that's extremely important. Another important thing would be that we hear about discrimination and the sometimes unconscious bias towards the migrants. And I hope to see that this year, this National Action Against Racism, National Action Plan Against Racism is introduced, because it's long overdue. And I think that apart from what James was presenting today in his possible resolution to eliminate the gap, I think that apart from a proper recognition of qualification, there is a need also for the public sector to act as a role model for the other sectors. In 2020, there was an OECD report which take on the inclusiveness in the workplaces, and they made clear that there is a role for the public sector to be a model in diversity management, and that the employment in that public sector adequately reflects diversity of the society represents. So if we can see that the migrants in the public sectors are employed in similar number as they represent, as they are represented in the society, and on managerial roles, and they are visible there. And for example, in RTE or some media, people can see migrants as anchors. That might change the attitude as well towards the migrants. And I think that what was recommended by the researchers, that it might be a good idea to consider to introduce the migrant wage gap, because that could bring the awareness amongst the society and employers that there's something wrong here, and that has to be tackled. All right, so that's all from me. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Barnaba. Really appreciate it. We'll sort of gather the rest of the colleagues who can now join the Q&A session. So number of questions in already, and I'm going to start doing my best to pass them on. So I know, Fran, you may have done written responses to a couple of the questions, but I just want to make sure we cover all the ground that's been asked about. So on that first issue then, where somebody asked the question about the exclusion of the non-formal workers, I mean, do we know, you know, what the impact is of that? Well, firstly, why was it done, and what's the impact? And I'm going to link it then to a sort of a second question, which is a similar question, which is this issue that we're really looking at nationals, non-nationals, as opposed to migrant, non-migrant. Now I know these, so there's essentially two sort of slightly tricky data issues going on there. So I'll leave it across the team as to who actually wants to take that one. But Fran, you want to take the lead?
Hi, Alan. Thanks, and hi, everybody, and thanks for joining. So in terms of the informal workers, yes, that's a good point. We wanted to acknowledge that they're not included because the wage data is from revenue, and informal workers wouldn't appear in that revenue data. Unfortunately, we have less of a sense of how that might affect the findings. You know, the informal work would tend to be low paid, but I think given we don't have reliable estimates, we just need to acknowledge that this is that those workers aren't included, and that's, you know, that's certainly something we would hope to pursue in further research, just to say that it wasn't that we excluded them. It was, so CSO matched the data with much thanks to CSO and technology, their role in matching this revenue data to labour force survey data, but you know, that they're just not there. So I suppose it's important for us to think in terms of doing any analysis about who's not there, and just sort of acknowledge that you know, the data sets or the data sources we're using will never be perfect. We just need to know what the limitations are. On to the next question. Very good point about nationality instead of migrants as a place of birth. And the term is, I mean, I'm not sure if you'd call it catchy exactly, but the international term that's used is the migrant wage gap. But actually, all that we have measured on the data with this really good wage data that we were very excited about is nationality, whether people were Irish nationals or not. We know from other research in this program, that there are differences between these groups. For East Europeans, not really. The biggest group actually that differs if you use a country of birth definition is the UK nationals. There are many UK born. There are many born in the UK and Northern Ireland, like myself, who are Irish nationals and don't count as migrants in the sense of being born outside the Republic of Ireland, but they aren't they aren't non-Irish. And there's also, as many of you will know, been quite a rapid increase in the acquisition of Irish citizenship. This is an important integration indicator of people who came here from non-EU countries. So they too wouldn't be included, but that group is much smaller than than those born in the UK who are Irish nationals. So I think it's good to acknowledge that. I think for many groups there's a really very substantial overlap between the two, between the non-national groups, non-Irish national groups, and the place of birth groups.
Yeah, just from memory, I know that this issue comes up a lot about where you've got citizenship rather than country of birth. And it's a long time since I've looked at this, but I know the discussion was that sometimes citizenship can be another indicator of integration and successful integration.
Yeah.
Whereby the fact that you're sort of excluding that group, you might have a sense of the direction of the impact, okay? And in a sense then, if it's the more successful migrants are the ones who tend to take out citizenship, they've been here for a long time, you know, and then I suppose the fact that they're not, or sorry, that they're being included in the Irish group means that the true underlying migrant wage gap is probably even bigger, albeit as said, maybe the effect isn't enormous, given that we're not talking about sort of very, very large numbers. And then presumably, again, the point you were making there, Fran, for Eastern Europeans, if you're a citizen of the European Union, this question arises of the additional benefits in the sense of Irish citizenship. So a host of things going on there, which are kind of complicated. Can I just ask the other data question that always comes up here? And it's I'm presuming the answer is no, but you didn't have any information on years since migration, I take it.
We didn't. We had we didn't on this data set, or we would have used it. What we have is job tenure, how long they've been in their current job, which we do account for. It is on average lower. I think the Irish employees, it's maybe 10 years, and the non-Irish, it's more like 5-6 years on average. You know, so we do account for that, which is obviously part of the issue, but and will be linked, of course. I mean, someone who's come very recently can't have worked in Ireland very long, but there can be people who have come and switched from, you know, a cafe job to a hotel job to a slightly more secure job. So we don't have their total duration in Ireland.
Okay, I don't see it in front of me here, but I saw it was the question earlier on. It's this issue of occupation and industrial sort of segregation, almost. And I guess there's a sort of parallel with the gender wage differential literature. So I think again, and again, between Sarah, James, and Fran, anybody can take this question. I think you control for industry and occupation, if I'm right, or maybe I got that wrong. But is there evidence of over concentration of migrants in certain lower paying occupations, which is partly driving what we're seeing?
Oh yeah, James. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So we do see some evidence of this. So if Fran, do please correct me if I've got the general trends wrong. But certain groups, I think Eastern Europeans in particular, for whom we saw the largest migrant wage gap, there does seem to be a kind of over concentration in service and food industry, much more than other groups as well. And interestingly, more recent years, the proportion of Asian nationals as well has kind of increased quite significantly in that group too. And then on the flip side, obviously, we see, you know, a very high concentration of Western Europeans, for example, in quite technical occupations as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I suppose just to add to that, Alan, it's yes, the diversity of the migrant sample, you know, the penalty is starkest for the East Europeans, but we do have, you know, there are plenty of migrants in Ireland working in high tech, in financial services, in pharmaceuticals. So, you know, there's concentration there too, but that's maybe working to the migrants' advantage. Just picking up on the sectoral issue, picking up on a point that Barnaba made, we do find that employees in the public sector earn more on average, controlling for other factors, and migrant, you know, non-Irish presence in the public sector varies again across groups, but is generally very low and much lower than than Irish nationals, particularly among the East Europeans. Almost all of them work in the private sector, and private sector, of course, that can be very well paid as well. But I think the point resonates more generally that you know, the public sector in Ireland should be as diverse as the public it serves. This is an action in the migrant integration strategy, but I think you know, that more could be done, or continued efforts need to be done that would help migrant wages. But there's also a whole host of other benefits, I think, and the benefits of having the the public sector as a sort of example, as the OECD argues in their Making Diversity Work publication from 2020. You know, that public sectors can really do a lot to showcase migrant integration in the labour market.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. Now let's move on to another question. So the questioner begins by saying it's a great presentation and insightful responses, so congratulations all around. Now the question, I'll give you the first one first. Does the migrant wage gap vary by education level? So I don't know, did you look within educational groups, and what's
yeah,
it look like?
So we did, yeah, it kind of that features a core part of the report itself. So for kind of more detailed information, do please read the report. But I think the the general finding was that the migrant wage gap is slightly higher for more highly educated migrants. And this is particularly true for some groups. And we were thinking around this, and the idea that potentially represents this issue that we were talking about regarding qualification recognition, really, and how a lot of migrants with maybe higher qualifications aren't able to convert that into the higher wages that Irish workers are able to do.
Interesting, very interesting. And then the second part of that question, again, I have to think about this for a second. Is there any chance that actively targeting a migrant wage gap could negatively impact the migrant employment gap, if such a gap exists? Okay, so I guess the question is, if I interpret it correctly, and apologies to the questioner if I'm not, but I suppose one way of sort of reducing a wage gap is almost to remove migrants, you know what I mean, at say at lower wage levels or whatever like that. So I'm not sure really what the mechanism could be here, but I think you can probably get that sort of sense. Maybe another way of looking at it is by actively encouraging more low-paid migrants into the labour force, or whatever like that. You could be expanding the wage gap, but at another level, it is presumably a good thing that you have higher employment rates amongst migrants. So I don't know, again, across Sarah, Fran, and James, do you want to reflect on that for a moment?
I can take that, Alan. Yes, I think it addresses this general point of, is there a trade-off between quality and quantity of employment more generally for migrants? I think the short answer I would give is probably not. The kinds of measures that would reduce the migrant wage gap are probably rather similar to some of the measures that would increase migrant employment. Thinking about, say, qualifications recognition, upskilling English language skills. I think monitoring recruitment practices, sort of equality monitoring and keeping an eye on what's going on in the organization and in terms of recruitment and promotion. I think those will both will reduce the migrant wage gap without having any damaging effect on migrant employment overall. And as anybody tuning in will know, there are labour shortages. Ireland needs labour at the moment, and certainly this is from another report coming soon at the end of March, the monitoring report on integration 2022. We have early indications that actually while migrant employment was harder hit during the COVID associated lockdowns, actually it has recovered remarkably well, and actually employment levels in 2022 among all of the groups are very close to pre-COVID levels. So I don't think that measures to improve matching, if you like, in the labour market and effective use of migrant skills will have an impact on migrant employment rates.
Okay, so we're going towards the end of the webinar, so I just want to make sure we get the following questions and thoughts in. Okay, and two components to this. One is this idea, where does Ireland rank relative to other countries in terms of the migrant wage gap? Okay, so is there evidence that we're doing relatively better, are relatively worse, are kind of similar to a lot of other countries. That's strand one to the question. And then the second part of this is that reduction that you saw over time. Okay, I mean, is that encouraging? Or is it a snail's pace of changing this? And I mean, I asked that question sort of safe in the knowledge too that because you're not following the same individuals over time. I mean, the migrant wage gap can change over time because of changes in composition rather than anything underlying it. But I'd be interested just in your reflections on the international comparison and the sort of progress over time.
Yeah, I could take the first part. There's an International Labour Organization publication which attempted to compare countries across Europe and high-income countries across the world. And caveats being they tended to use self-reported wages data, and it's a bit of an earlier period as well. But they tended to find that Ireland ranked quite highly amongst high-income countries for its migrant wage penalty. And I think, if I remember off the top of my head, the EU average was about 8 or 9%, and Ireland was up at around 20% or so. So it's very much kind of up at the higher end based on this kind of older data, and the data itself is self-reported.
Okay, and maybe Fran, do you want to think about the question then over time?
Yes, I think in terms of, is it encouraging? Well, yes, I suppose any change and reduction is encouraging because it suggests it's amenable to change. Alan made a good point. Of course, we have repeated cross sections, as it's known in the business, but we're not following the same people over time. But we do know from the data that part of the explanation of the smaller gap in the later period, in the much more recovery period, is to do with the fact that the migrants are they're higher skilled, their higher education levels, slightly older, and they're working in better jobs. So it is a slightly more skilled population. This also coincided with a period of rapidly of increasing work permits, critical skills work permits for non-EU migrants. These are in, like it says on the tin, critical skills. These are well-paid jobs, say in the health sector or whatever. So there was an increase in critical skills. We do find that there's there is still, even after accounting for the characteristics of migrants, there is still a reduction even after, say, accounting for those. So it could be in a tightening labour market where there are more opportunities available. Maybe migrants are getting those chances that employers are maybe more likely to take migrants where previously they wouldn't. And of course, then we can't rule out a certain level of changes in things that we don't measure, like for example, language skills, that maybe the other cohort had slightly better language skills. But I would be inclined to say, based on the evidence that we have, that this bodes well for a gap, at least in terms of when there's plenty of demand for labour, as currently.
Okay. Thanks for that. I want to squeeze in one last issue that's been raised, and this is from Sandra Ruiz. And apologies, Sandra, if I don't sort of paraphrase your question completely correctly, but I just want to make sure we get it in. But this finding of the double disadvantage for migrant women, I think is a very important one. And Sandra is essentially raising this question about whether or not does there need to be a sort of a gender dimension to immigrant integration policy. Okay, so I know we've had the migration strategy, the immigrant strategy, and everything like that. So, Sandra, again, talking about gender mainstreaming across policies, but I think this is an interesting one in the specifics. I think we tend to talk about migrants, we tend to talk about policy towards migrants, but do we need a specific gender dimension in and again, across James, Sarah, and Francis, you should feel free to try your answer on that one. Who's going to be brave?
I think this is an excellent point, Sarah, and I think there is a strategy for women and girls and a migrant integration strategy. But this report really speaks to the fact that there's an overlap and the experience is different for migrant women, and that incorporated into the new strategies as they're being developed, there needs to be acknowledgement that there is a gender dimension of migrant integration.
Okay, James, you want to add?
Yeah, just to follow up. I think that's absolutely right, and it tends to be, I suppose, intersecting kind of issues that arise with the gender dimension anyway, of things like over concentration, sometimes in care work, which is usually lower paid, part-time, and can be quite precarious, and that often comes with having to manage family responsibilities as well. So there's that clear gender dimension, and then when that's compounded with a migrant dimension, which often overrepresents women within migrants within that care work as well, you have a kind of, I suppose, a compounding of potential problems that can occur. And so kind of taking account, I think, definitely of the occupational distribution as well, and the managing familial responsibilities, both as women and as migrants, and how they can interact is critical.
Very, very interesting. I'll say so. Thanks again, Sandra, for bringing up that point. Listen, I said at the outset that we'd make sure we get people out on time. So I see it's 12:17, so we drift over by a minute or two. So I should bring proceedings to a close. But once again, I just want to thank Fran, James, and Sarah, and indeed Eilish, one of the authors. Congratulations to you all on a fascinating report. I want to thank again the department for funding. Thanks everybody for coming along today and engaging. And by the likes of things, Fran, we'll be gathering again at the end of March. You suggested that there'll be the integration monitoring report will be coming out at the end of March.
Yes.
Good. So you've put a gun to your own head there. In terms of a very publicly imposed deadline. So we'll look forward to seeing that and having that discussion then in a couple of months' time. Okay, so with that, I just wish thanks again to everybody, and wish everybody an enjoyable rest of the day. So bye-bye.
Thanks, Alan.